Well, there's been a big international investigation report released this morning that shows that the South African bank Investec may have been helping people to scam German tax authorities. It's a complex scam, but as I understand it, at the time, under German law, if you sold certain shares, you could get a tax refund. So under the scheme, people would sell the shares back and forth to each other, which would mean they could claim the refund more than once. That's where the scam came in. As the Amabhungane Centre for Investigative Journalism explains it, Investec would provide hundreds of millions of euros to allow investors to make those trades several times, and thus they got the profits from the tax rebates that were then duplicated. The key to this is that the shares were being sold back and forth so that people could actually claim the rebate more than once. The person who broke the story this morning in South Africa is Dewald van Rensberg. Dewald, good afternoon to you, from the Amabhungane Centre, I should say. Good afternoon. I mean, this is one of these nice and complicated stories. It involves shares and deals. So how are people taking advantage of the German tax system?
Okay, so it is pretty complicated, and I think that's often the case. That's the point. The point is to make it complicated and stay ahead of the authorities. So what you do, essentially, is you buy shares in a company that's going to declare dividends. You get your dividends, there's a withholding tax that gets paid to the government. You get a tax certificate, you will claim your tax at the end of the year. That's all good and fine. But in the background, you have friends who are undertaking kind of surreptitiously some transactions at the same time that will ensure that your shares will end up with one of them, and it will appear as though they have bought the shares at the same time you had them before the dividend was declared, which then entitles them to also claim the same tax refund you had. So essentially you have two refunds for every transaction. Now, the way you make money of this is to scale it up as far as you can. So the more money you have, the more shares you buy, and the bigger the tax rebates, of course. And although we're going to have a second part of this story tomorrow, so far as today's story is concerned, we've shown Investec to have been involved as that provider of capital, the person who provides the loans that allows you to scale up the transaction.
Okay, so the people who were doing this were doing it illegally. They were making this money illegally. In fact, they've been prosecuted for doing this.
Well, this is the interesting thing, right? So it kind of gives you a window into the world of investment banking and the way people operate and think there. And they really consciously and intentionally kind of skirt the line between what's legal and isn't legal. And that's really how you make your money. Now, a lot of people would still insist that this is legal, that it was legal at the time. There was no law against it. It was just an unfortunate loophole that the lawmakers in Germany, for instance, left open. And just because you could make money in an immoral way doesn't mean you made it in an illegal way. Now, that avenue of argument has been closed this year when Germany's highest federal court made a landmark judgment saying that trades of this nature, it's called cum-ex trades, that were executed as far back as 2007, are in fact fraud, are obviously illegal. I mean, that's the argument made. It's so obviously wrong that no one in good faith could have done these things and thought, no, I can hide behind legalities. So it's been a long path for it to be actually considered criminal, despite having been so obviously wrong.
So then Investec, as you say, were providing the capital. They were lending people, I mean, on your view, hundreds of millions of euros. So that's a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And they knew what this money was going to be used for. I mean, that's part of the problem for Investec, right?
Well, very much. The documentation we have at hand. I mean, this is kind of legally treacherous ground to walk, obviously. But the documentation at hand show people who worked with Investec on the other side of the table, talking very openly with them about what they're going to do, what they need the money for, when they need the money, how they're going to execute their trades. They went and met with Investec employees about it. So the argument is easy to make, or hard to dispute, rather, that Investec did not know precisely what it was giving money for.
How does Investec respond to this? I mean, this is, I would imagine, quite difficult for their brand.
Well, one imagines that they do kind of present themselves as a paragon of clean governance. So there's two things here. I think the response they gave us, and we sent a fairly comprehensive list of questions. The response to us was very limited. They took issue with maybe 3 things we put to them, and the rest was kind of a vague, bold denial and citing client confidentiality and so on. And then the official announcements to shareholders, kind of buried in the financial statements, they've said that maybe there's some kind of liability from some very distant historical transactions and so on. But in reality, the documents about investigations involving Investec are very recent. They come from 2020. So it's obviously not a legacy issue. It's very much a contemporary issue for them.
I mean, this is really quite a bizarre story. You say more information is going to come out, but they seem to know what was going on. I mean, there are lots of emails. I mean, there's a lot of documentation that you've been going through here, and you've been working with journalists in Germany on this.
Yeah, and just to be clear, there's an enormous amount of documentation I did not use on a variety of very large banks across the world. Sifting through that to find things on Investec was kind of the angle I took for obvious reasons. Much of it reflects on major international banks from elsewhere, and a lot of that documentation is incredibly damning. But the documentation we have, and again, it's so hard to pass through because it's mostly German, so it took quite a while to work through what I think it was 200,000 pages of documents. I think we kind of isolated what we can about their role, and you kind of only get an inkling of what they did as a counterparty to what other people did, which is to say the evidence and investigations into other people then provide a window into the investigations and information on Investec, because they are not the primary targets of German prosecution.
Dewald van Rensberg from the Amabhungane Center for Investigative Journalism. I really appreciate the time. Quite a complicated story. Thank you very much indeed.